Welcome to our 11th video on Blender, and today we're going to be continuing to look at the Properties Editor, and we're going to try to highlight mostly the features from it and maybe some of the related things that we'll run across in here too as well. While each editor is on its own and separate, they interact with the other editors. And so you might find that being able to switch between 2 or 3 different editors, the 3D viewport, of course, would be most common, but even like the outliner, they all can do great things assisting one another as you work through a scene. I'm going to switch over here in my tabs to the scene settings. You can actually create multiple scenes in a project. I've only done that for one project that I've ever done, and that was for a game to make a heads-up display as you went through to see like score and points render. As far as in actually creating a 3D animation or something, I'm not sure that would be a useful tool or not, but there's some different options. You can also turn off layers to render. So for instance, if I hold down Shift and I click on a particular layer, then I can turn on or off one. That might be handy, for instance, if you have an object that's together and then you're going to one that is a version of that object that can fall apart and break into lots of pieces. That would be something where you might have it rendering up to a certain point, switch off that layer, switch on the other layer that has the modified version of your 3D model, and you can work with it from there. You can do a lot of playing around with how it interacts with time as you go through in these different parts. I'm going to go ahead and one thing really quick on this, I haven't played around with this, but if you get a really complex scene that you're rendering, sometimes they have what they call fireflies, where it's little like bright points of light that look like they're scattered through here, and usually turning up the render settings can get rid of them. Another method of that is the denoising, and also to help kind of make things a little bit more even. I haven't played around with this much, but we'll play around with it this year as we go through our different projects that we'll be doing. In our next category over, we have our scene settings, and you can change cameras if you have more than one camera in a scene. Any object can be created to make a camera. You can also, if you really want to, you could actually set to specific units where it's going to identify them. For instance, I can change length, or I can change from imperial to metric. I could also do degrees, where I can change that to radians. That is totally non-essential for what we're doing in here. There's no benefit other than you give somebody else a scale that you're trying to create your model to represent. Usually as you create, you will decide how you want these grid marks to kind of play out in your model, what you want them to represent. You might even just be using them as a general reference without specific measurements. And so that's just something to keep in mind. As I go further down, we have some, again, more settings that I'm not going to get into, from audio to color management. I'm going to talk about gravity just very briefly, because if I go over to my physics panel, and if we're working with particles or anything dealing with physics, then gravity is going to probably have an effect on it. You can turn off that effect on some things. So if I go over to my physics tab and I say add active, for instance, I'm going to reduce this animation to 25 frames, 10% of what it was. And if I hit play, I can see that it starts to fall down. It's going down at an acceleration of negative 9.81. This would be a number associated with meters per second, or meters per second squared. In physics, it's a very well-known number. If you were doing it in feet, you might put 32 for 32 feet per second per second. And so again, as I work with this, I might want, for some reason, I might want gravity to be more, or I might want it to be less. And so the smaller the number, the less effect it's going to have. Of course, you could even make it positive. Maybe you're modeling a balloon that's a helium balloon and you want it to float away in the scene. So you could either make it float away fast or you can make it float away gently. That's totally up to you. Maybe you want it to seem like there's a little bit of a crosswind carrying it as it goes. And so you could do that. And you should also be able to animate these individually. And so you can write and insert keyframes, change values. I've never tried that, and not sure how well that would work or not, but there you go. I'm going to hit escape to stop my animation there. When I created this rigid body, and it's an active rigid body, it created down here a rigid body world, and so I can use that to change or affect settings. You can also do a thing called baking, where there's a lot of simulation type things that Blender does that when you bake, what it does is it calculates all the items. This would bake all dynamics, so if you have more than one, you can hit that to rebake everything. And it can save those in a place so it can access that data without having to do those calculations. So if you're running through a preview of your scene and you just want to hit play and run it through, if it's doing the calculations on the fly, depending how complex those are, it might take it a long time to do. Whereas if you bake them, it could do them very quickly and make your scene run a little bit more fluid. When you run an animation, it'll show you how many frames per second. 24 is the maximum I should see there. Sometimes, depending on what's going on with the scene, you might see it pop above 24 frames per second. But in general, that's what we'll be rendering at for animations, is 24 frames per second. I'm going to go a little bit further down. I also have this rigid body field weights. And since we have a rigid body environment, I can click on this. And I could actually use this to take away the effect of gravity and then to add the effect of gravity. And so you can play around with these different things to modify how your rigid body world is affected by these different forces. You can actually add different forces by going to Shift A in the viewport. And here I have some different force fields. I have wind, vortex. You'll notice that these pretty much match these over here. And so they kind of correlate together. And you can actually have them affected by affecting each other. So if I go down to here, I go to force field and I click on vortex. And let's go ahead and move that to the center. I'm going to do Shift S. I'm going to say cursor to center, Shift S again, selection to cursor. And I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And I'm going to move this so that we have 250 frames again. And I'm going to go up to where I had my gravity. I'm going to make this 0. And so I have that very slightly. And so as I start to put in these forces, I'm going to have to make sure that that box can actually interact with those forces. And to do that, I would actually go to this last tab. And so here I have force field, rigid body constraint, type vortex, and so I can go and I can do some different settings here, but these are all kind of fun things to mess around and play with. We won't do a lot with physics other than just getting a little bit used to it. I'll come back to that a little bit later too. I'm going to select my cube, and you'll notice I have different options here as well. I'm going to click on that force field, and we're going to go back to our first spot here. I'm going to bring this down like so, and I'm going to hit play, and I didn't see an effect there, but it might be because I don't have it strong enough. I might need to increase some of those forces acting on it. I think those settings should actually work together, but I have to play with it. But if you have things dropping active, you can change its bounciness, change the mass of objects, the type of collision that it has. This is pretty in-depth, so of course that's something that I'd want to cover at a later time just to go a little bit more detail. I'm going to go ahead and go back to our constraints, and we're actually into our world settings. And one last thing here too as well. I guess I was in this one. Yes, covered everything there. Good. So in the world settings, we can also use change what our world looks like. So for instance, if I'm in render mode, so I'm going to do Shift Z in the viewport, and I change this to cycles render, which is one that I want to use, just in case yours looks different if you try this out. I can change the colors over here, or I just hit escape to exit that. I can use nodes to do color editing. We will use nodes a lot. What I do when I use nodes is I leave my timeline down here, but I pull down to create another little window. I'm going to pull this one up, do the bottom of the header to pull it up. And I'm going to pull it up a little ways to give myself some space so I can change this to the node editor. And in the node editor, if I click on the world icon down here, I can see what I set there. I could actually change this in here. So if I do Shift A, maybe I want to add a texture to the world. I could do a sky texture. Put that in there. Not sure why everything turned dark. Oh, it's probably because I have that going into the vectors there. Let's move that back this way. And oddly enough, usually I would get a result from that. So let's do that into color over here. So I'm going to take that, just move it over into here. I'm going to take this to background to surface, and there we go. So now I get this horizon view with some different changes of color there. So there's different things that we can play with, of course, in the settings. We're going to get into that much more later as well. A couple more things I just want to cover briefly are in this next section where you actually have your object. This shares a lot of similarities between the settings in the transform menu. I could even see these settings if I tab into my object. So I'm going to do Shift Z to go back to shaded mode. I'm going to hit tab to go into edit mode here, so that this is a little bit different, but I can still see these here is to do the rotation, scale, and transformation for this object. And I was playing around with this a little bit earlier. Oddly enough, it didn't do like undos for that. There's also, you can lock the axes just like you can on that one. Identifies what layer it's on. I have some rigid body settings here because I have a rigid body object. So there's some different settings in here that you can see, including looking at some motion path settings, some different places to kind of explore in there. And we will cover some more of those later with some of the tools that we'll use. We'll call this video good, and our next one will be looking at constraints, and probably the next one will focus just on constraints. There's quite a bit that we can cover in that. And we'll cover modifiers in another video, and as well as the other settings here.